All right, welcome everybody. I'd like to begin today's Australia at Home instalment with acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. In my case, I join you from the land of the people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I would also like to extend respect and a welcome to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining with us today. My name is Josh Bornstein. I head up the Employment and Industrial Law team at Maurice Blackburn. As it happens, Maurice Blackburn has been working in the field of labour law for the last 101 years, and this year we're very proud to partner with the Australia at Home series.
Sacrifice movies for how much?
I will just also mention a few ground rules for this afternoon. For those who haven't been to one of these events, they're designed to be pretty relaxed and respectful and inclusive. So in order to enjoy the most of, or get the most out of it, please, if you haven't already done so, turn your screen to gallery mode on the top right-hand corner and turn your cameras on so we can get a sense of the people who have joined us for this discussion. You can open the chat button at the bottom of the screen and introduce yourselves and put in questions as we go today for the panellists. I'll try and get to some of those questions during the course of the discussion. If anybody's having any tech issues, Ariane is doing a terrific job already, I can assure you, of providing tech support, so please message her direct. And just to let people know, we are videoing and placing online today's discussion, so we have to watch our P's and Q's and be polite. Before I get to the subject of the discussion, I'd like to introduce our panellists. First, I'll start with Tim Kennedy, who's the National Secretary of the United Workers Union. Tim's union includes workers from a range of different industries and range of different sectors, including people in cleaning public places, people in logistics and supply, agricultural workers, I think even security workers as well. The UWU is the product of an amalgamation between United Voice Union and also the NUW, and has put together a very ambitious, and some might say radical new organising structure. Sarah Kaine, welcome as well. Sarah is an Associate Professor at the University of Technology and in its Sydney Business School. Sarah lectures in Human Resource Management and Industrial Relations, and her research focuses on the gig economy and the development of exercise of employee voice. Many of you will know her through her writing on The Conversation, and Sarah is lucky enough to be joining us from Byron Bay today, which is the source of huge jealousy if, like the rest of the panel, you're stuck in a slightly depressed Melbourne. I can also welcome Clare ONeil, who's the federal member for Hotham and Shadow Minister for Innovation, Technology and the Future of Work. She's also the co-author with Tim Watts of a fascinating book by the name of Two Futures. She's very well acquainted with Melbourne's southeast and was at one time mayor of the Greater Dandenong. And at the moment, she, like some of her, or like in fact all of her parliamentary colleagues, is on indefinite unpaid pandemic leave, or perhaps she wouldn't agree with that. All right, let's get to the discussion today, and we're focusing on what's going on in the world of work, in the labour market, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we will have all seen, the pandemic has had a profound impact on just about every aspect of our lives, and has put various institutions and structures in our society under great strain and under the spotlight. We think no further than what's going on in healthcare, frontline workers, what's going on in education, in social welfare, but it's also highlighting aspects of the labour market and what's going on at work. And under that spotlight, some of the less attractive features of the labour market are being laid bare. Over the last 40 years, and I might just refer to a text that is a bit of a Bible for me, over the last 40 years, one of the most dramatic changes we've seen in the labour market is the move away from secure full-time employment to less secure forms of work. And the person who highlighted that for me, I think most brilliantly, was an academic in America by the name of David Weil, who in 2014 published a book called The Fissured Workplace. He refers to the process of fissuring work, splintering up what used to be big factories or big collections of employees in one workplace, largely on full-time arrangements, into smaller, less secure forms of work. And he wrote, as major companies have consciously invested in building brands and devoted customers as the cornerstone of their business strategy, they've also shed their role as the direct employer of the people responsible providing those products and services. And fissuring work takes many forms. It can be franchising, it can be labour hire, it can be short-term, fixed-term, casual, contracting arrangements, independent contracting arrangements, gig arrangements. There's many different forms and permutations of fissuring labour, but we've seen a lot of the impact of the pandemic on workers working in less secure forms of employment. And I'd like to start today's discussion by throwing to Tim, if I could, because Tim and his union's members are really working on the front line of this pandemic. And I'd really like to just ask a very general question of Tim, which is, Tim, what has been the experience of the union's members during this pandemic, and what has the union learnt about the labour market and what needs to be done, if anything, about it?
Oh, thanks, Josh, and good afternoon, everyone. I think your introduction fits very nicely into the challenge and the struggle that the United Workers Union's in. Working people were in a crisis before the COVID pandemic hit us in Australia, and had been for some time. Not just precarious nature of work and the fact that we've been campaigning for over a decade for jobs you can count on, but the strangulation of wages and the loss of worker voice in the workplace and in society in general, and the loss of collective bargaining power, the decline of the effectiveness of unions. Working people were under enormous stress going into the bushfire season. Then we found ourselves in a crisis now of a pandemic nature, which is a health crisis, now an economic and a social crisis. And what it's simply done, Josh, is reveal and sharpen the existing problems and inequalities and contradictions and tensions in the way the world of work works. And so, you know, we have a situation today where we're relying on people, and especially we're feeling it right now in Victoria and the city of Melbourne, people who primarily are in insecure, casual, precarious work, requiring to turn up to work every day to make certain that the things that we need for society to continue occurs. And so in the last couple of weeks, we've been dealing with COVID outbreaks in our logistics supply chain, within our food production supply chain, where initially workers weren't even engaged about the outbreaks in their workplaces. So how can we actually deal with it? And so it's taken a number of instances where in stronger United Workers Union sites is where we've taken industrial action, ceased work, and made certain that the employer talks to the workers about who has COVID, make certain people can isolate, get deep clean through those facilities. Now, we can do that at organised, unionised places, but too often the reality is that risk and that phenomenon that you talked about has been pushed down the supply chain, down the contract chain onto individual workers who can't deal with it. The most egregious example, I would say, is with the start of the inquiry into hotel quarantine, is that you have a 40 years of governments contracting out to the private sector, public, very important public work and public goods, and then having a subcontracting chain, which is about maximising private economic gain at the expense of the social good. And so you have workers who are security workers who are on $20 an hour, part of a subcontracting chain, who are not picked up by JobSeeker or JobKeeper. They're casual workers, they're on visas or they're international students, and they're the people being blamed for our pandemic response. Belies. I can't believe it actually that narrative got out into the media, and it's a bit of a problem. So, the challenges for us at the moment, Josh, is how we can actually take action every day to make certain the worker voice is heard. Because if we don't have safe and healthy workplaces, and if people don't feel financially secure to make right decisions, we won't get on top of this pandemic where we are right now.
So is it more difficult to ensure standards of occupational health and safety with a fissured workplace environment, a more precarious workplace environment? Is it different from a more secure workforce?
Yeah, it's completely different, because where does the legal risk reside in this relationship? And as you would well know, the whole idea of a fissured workplace is to move the risk away from where capital's power resides. And so we've found in this environment that the inconsistencies about workers having a voice about health and safety, about making smart health decisions about how we conduct ourselves in workplaces, which 70% of Australian workers have to present to a physical workplace in order to do their jobs. For many of us on this forum, we're lucky enough to work from home, and we're very much a privileged minority. The reality is we have a situation where too often we rely on the employer and their good common sense and their interests to make good health and safety decisions, and they simply don't. And we've had that either with a major supermarket retailer all the way down to a small food manufacturer, where they will constantly try and not make a smart decision in the hope that it won't matter, because they want to maximise their economic return. And too often it's the workers who actually pay the price. So, we've had a situation where we represent the workers in the cold store at JBS Swift, which is an abattoir of 1,500 workers. We represent about 120 of them. We've had to shut down that entire site in order to kind of deal with it. But the communication from the company was just not effective to the nature of that workforce. So you had people being sent home with no pay and said, don't come back to work for 2 weeks, with no context about why. And as a result, those people are going out into the community and trying to do shopping. I mean, there is not a proper health and safety response when you actually have these fissured workplaces, Josh.
Okay. And there's been something of a campaign in recent weeks about the need for paid pandemic leave. Would that make a difference?
It would make a major difference, because basically we could actually stand in solidarity with everyone in this country and make certain that we are all in this together, and so people can make sensible decisions. It's not a hard idea to understand that my security is bound up in your security, and if we can make sensible decisions around security and health decisions, then we can get on top of these pandemics. The fact that people don't have economic security means that they can't make those decisions. The United Workers Union has one paid pandemic leave at many places where we have strength. But the reality is most workers now don't have access to sick leave, let alone paid pandemic leave. And if Australia wants to actually make certain that we respect everyone in the workplace, we need universal paid sick leave, but we also need, in addition to that, universal paid pandemic leave. So those workers, many of whom are now being sent home on an unpaid situation, can't make sensible decisions. Those workers, 40% of workers in our areas are labour hire casual. They don't have any access to paid leave. They can't make sensible decisions. So as a result, they need to work. And all the signals from our governments and from our major employers is we just don't want to know about that. We just want to turn a blind eye and hope we skate through. And that's not really, there's no social solidarity in that. And it is a real threat for Australia. I think that the breakdown in social solidarity is showing that when the chips are down, this becomes very much a class issue, Josh. We very quickly throw workers under the bus.
You said something a bit jolting there, which is most workers don't have access to paid sick leave. Is that right?
Well, if you're a casual, you don't have access to paid sick leave. That's
correct. But most, in terms of, perhaps I'll ask Sarah this. She may have a ready answer to this. I suppose, Sarah, the question is, to what extent is the workforce now made up of insecure workers? Do we have data about that? And I know in recent days, one of the industry lobbyists, Scott Barklam from, I think, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, protested about an ABC journalist using the words insecure work in a report on the ABC News. And Barklam said that's a loaded and misleading term and you shouldn't use it. And I assume he was arguing that because he contests how much insecure work there really is out there and whether in fact it's a growing problem or whether, as some employers argue, that the percentage of insecure workers hasn't increased in this country. Do you have any insight into that difficult question?
I think it's an interesting question, and the term insecure work, I think, is probably more useful than talking about the proportion of casual workers. I think what the employers point to, and I've seen politicians do this as well, is ABS statistics. And the way that the ABS counts casual and other forms of work has kept that proportion of the workforce quite constant at 25% for the past 20 years or so. Now, there's a couple of things about that need to be sort of unpacked. One is 25% of the workforce is still quite a large proportion of the workforce. That's still one in four workers. The second is we know about, the ABS is great at giving us some snapshots, but we know that there are limitations with how you capture particular categories of worker. And so when we talk about insecure work, I much prefer thinking along the lines of the different aspects of insecure work. So to suggest that you can test the extent of insecure work by equating it to casual work is like trying to test a person's overall well-being by taking their temperature. It's a very limited way of understanding insecure work. So Jim Stanford and the Centre of Future Work a couple of years ago did a really great report. If anyone's interested, you can look at their website, which looked at, I think it was about 11 features of insecure work, which of course goes to your employment contract, but goes to other things such as low pay, your status in terms of whether you're a migrant worker, an international student, etc. Also, other things which we haven't traditionally spoken about, but I think that Tim alluded to, which is the capacity to bargain. So how many workers are covered by agreements anymore, which in turn we've seen affects, in a COVID environment, affects the capacity to organise at the workplace. So I think it's much more useful to think in terms of that broader features of insecure work, which are harder to sort of aggregate, but give you a much better sense of what's going on than simply looking at, well, what's the employment contract? And I think the other thing that needs to be taken into account is people's perception of work. And that certainly over time has been a sense by employees that they are less secure in their jobs. And that you can't unpack that from the other factors, including, the degree of union representation at the workplace. So it's a bigger issue than just casuals.
Would you agree that, for example, people who work for labour hire companies may not necessarily be classified as casual workers, but don't have security of employment because the labour hire company can be removed from a site at the behest of the lead company fairly quickly?
Look, that's the point. And I think you mentioned a favourite of mine, David Weil, early on. And I think that's the point that David always raises so cogently, is that it's business structures that also determine. It's not just your employment status. And again, we see that with the security situation in Victoria. It's not just your employment status. It's also the business structures that you work within or for. When we've seen that in franchising as well. You could have been employed directly by a franchise 7-Eleven, etc. But that doesn't mean you weren't experiencing what would fall under that umbrella of insecure work.
You should be a brave person to call a 7-Eleven worker a a worker with security of employment, I suppose.
Well, I'd be interested in hearing that argument.
Yes. Just to flesh that out a bit more, I just had a memory, Tim, of Amazon's first foray into Australia, and I think that might have actually been in a facility in Dandenong or out that way. Can you talk through the structure that Amazon introduced? Because my recollection is it involved a very different employment arrangement than what had been the case prior to them arriving.
Yes. Well, Amazon, as you know, put a great deal of effort into making certain that workers can't collectively organise and bargain with the company. And the way that they approach the Australian situation is that they realise that may be a problem if they employed people. So when they set up operation here in Australia, in Dandenong, is that everyone who worked at that warehouse was employed by a labour hire agency, right up until quite a few levels of management and oversight into it. As a consequence, they said they had no responsibility for the Amazon workers whatsoever. And the scheme of the act, as you know, Josh, meant that, who could we bargain with? We couldn't bargain with the actual source of the decision making, which is as Amazon wanted it. And as a result, they were able to maintain control through that mechanism.
And did that have implications for the workers' pay rates?
The implications for the worker pay rates is that the workers could never collectively bargain around their terms and conditions, whether it be wage rates or the way that they're scheduled to work, the way that they've actually called in to work, and the amount of hours that they could be guaranteed and how they could work their work-life family balance also restricted their capacity to talk around health and safety issues. So you had a high churn, as we call it, as people work there for a period of time and just get fed up and look for something else.
Yeah, and that clearly would have implications for health and safety if you've got a workforce which has got a high churn rate.
Well, there's no obligation on the company or interest to actually train people around these things because that's not their responsibility, of course.
All right. I might ask, in fact, all of the panel might have an interest in this, but in recent days, smack bang in the middle of this pandemic in Victoria, a report commissioned, I think, by the Victorian government was handed down handed to the Victorian government by Natalie James, the former Fair Work Ombudsman, and it addressed the question of gig work, another form of insecure work, and made a whole series of recommendations about what to do about gig work. Gig workers are treated as self-employed business people, entrepreneurs, independent contractors. And perhaps I'll ask Sarah first to comment, if she can, about the report and its recommendations.
Thanks, Josh. Look, I think the report is very useful for all jurisdictions, and I'm glad that the Victorians undertook it. So that's a thank you to the rest of the, to Victoria from the rest of the country on this account, I've got to say, which you might need at the moment. Look, I think the recommendations are overall sensible, if a bit tricky. So many of the recommendations, if you go through the report, look at, I guess, that interplay and intersection between the federal and state roles in terms of the regulation of work. But I do think there are particular aspects that are worth considering in and of themselves. The first is, of course, we all know that a huge point of contention both here and around the world with regard to the gig economy is the classification of gig workers as independent contractors. And to date, that classification has been unilaterally decided by the employer with the onus on the gig worker to disprove that. And that in the Australian context has not been particularly successful. And so I think one of the key aspects out of the report and the recommendations is the idea that it should be up to the party claiming non-employee status to demonstrate why that is the case. And I think if we're talking about I think in the report, Natalie terms it in terms of the capacity of the parties to leverage their positions, which I took as code for the power of each party to negotiate. I think it's really important that if gig platforms, multinational billion-dollar gig platforms, are deciding unilaterally that they should have to prove that's the case. So I think that's a really useful suggestion. I think many of us with an interest in this space would also agree with things like trying to align the definitions across different legislative frameworks, which is just seemed annoying and odd and has added a layer of complexity that's been unnecessary. So I think many of the recommendations are really sensible and in an ideal world would be pursued. The tricky part of it, and maybe Claire's able to comment on this a little bit, the tricky part of this, of course, is where the responsibilities of the state and federal governments start and end, and how much capacity there is for the state to intervene. However, in saying that, and again citing David Weil, I think we overlook a lot of the time the capacity for states and local government jurisdictions to use a whole range of regulatory powers in a creative way to regulate all kinds of working arrangements. And if we see in the US, we know that that's been happening with the Taxi and Limousine Commission in New York, where there's an incapacity to sort of federally regulate in the gig economy. They have taken a particular role in regulating rideshare in New York City. So I still think, and I can see a little bit of it in the recommendations, but I still think we really underutilise local regulatory frameworks that fall outside of labour law. And again, that's a David Weil suggestion with his idea of strategic enforcement. And for anyone who's listening who hasn't read David's work on strategic enforcement, if you're in the space of labour regulation, it's really worth it.
Thank you very much. And that's a fascinating segue to Clare because, Clare, I want you to just ignore everything that Sarah said about state legislatures and frameworks taking over the field just for the time being, because I don't want you to hand pass this question back to the state. I'm keen to understand the ALP's position, the opposition's position on this important issue. At the moment, the people who deliver takeaway food on bicycles are classified as entrepreneurs, as self-employed business people. They have an ABN, they have no business plan, they've got no capital behind them, they may be couch surfing, they may be on visas, and to me, that whole debate about independent contractors versus employees has been dealt with by courts for the past 25 years. The way that's been dealt with is a complete joke. And in fact, the Chief Justice of the Federal Court said the same thing in the last few days in the judgment. It's a joke. This is a joke that we're dealing with, this binary choice, administering this prehistoric legal approach to the gig economy. So I've got a very direct question. Does the federal opposition support reclassifying gig workers like these people, millennials on bikes, as employees?
Well, I don't think it's as simple as that. And I don't think anyone in the policy discussion indeed wants all gig workers to be reclassified as employees. I think what Natalie James's report really showed is that the federal government is the right body to be regulating these arrangements, and it's not making any realistic attempt to do so. And that has to change. And I think that federal Labor will reach a view that that's inappropriate, and that the federal government does need to step in and take a stronger stance on whether these workers are being treated fairly and whether they're not. Something that's really interesting about that report is that it's been argued for a long time that gig is really small and, a kind of too small to be relevant really in this conversation. And Natalie's report shows that actually 1 million Australians are deriving some part of their income from the gig economy. So clearly, affecting the lives of, almost 10% of the labour force, and it's something that does need to be very much looked at. I'm sure a lot of you on this discussion observe this, but there's a real kind of culture, because many of these platforms are digitally enabled. So I mean, someone's invented a new piece of technology that it kind of is like takes on this like mythical quality because there's a piece of tech involved in the middle, when some of it is just straight up worker exploitation that's been happening since, the employment relationship was created. And those people shouldn't be allowed to hide behind a piece of technology to say that it's any different. I think it's, something else Natalie's report showed was that 40% of people who are getting gig work don't know how much they're getting paid. So as well as all the issues that Sarah talked about around the difficulty of organising these workers, there's a transparency problem here that we wouldn't tolerate in any other area of work, yet for some reason, because it's digital, we're abiding by a different set of rules. So I think her report was good. It clearly points the finger at the federal government as the relevant party, but I think the Victorian government's done something pretty important here, which is say that they're not going to sit around and wait for the federal government to take action while people are being exploited. They're going to step in and do something, and I'm sure that'll give a model for federal Labor to follow. If I can just step back a little bit from the gig question, Josh, I think the fact that 1 million Australians are seeking to supplement their income through gig work shows us something very important about the broader issue here, which is that we have had in previous generations in Australia, a cornerstone of our social contract has been people being able to live a good life in this country because they've got a job and they work hard at their job. And that part of Australian life is disintegrating. So, Tim talked a bit about what COVID's shown us about insecure work. I think a lot of Australians are really seeing for the first time how much these employment arrangements have bled into parts of the economy that they probably find a bit unexpected. So we've talked about security guards, but don't forget aged care. Like, these are the people that politicians all around the country are getting up and saying these are our heroes, and yet these people are very poorly paid, like earning $21, $22, $23 an hour. They're having to work across multiple sites. They've got no job security and all the attendant problems that come with that. And one of the things that COVID's really an important opportunity for us to see is that this type of employment arrangement and the whole problem of insecurity in work, it's predominant amongst certain groups of Australians. So this is not an equal opportunity problem, which is affecting everyone in the workforce. If you're a woman, you're much more likely to be bearing the brunt of this. If you didn't get the opportunity to study much beyond university, you're much more likely to be in these precarious employment arrangements. And if you're working in specific areas of the economy, you're more likely to be subject to these things. Just one final point before we move away from it. This is a problem that government has a lot of control over, because many of the jobs that I just talked about there, government ultimately pays the bills here. So when we're talking about anyone that's working in the caring professions, for example, government is ultimately paying for this person's wages. Even in the university sector, 70% of researchers in Australia are in insecure work. Now that's just, that is basically government policy that's allowed that to happen. If we think about childcare workers, disability workers, like some of the fastest growing parts of the economy, many of which are dependent on government, ultimately are breeding grounds for this type of work to proliferate. And so I think we need to be honest here about it's the community and it's politicians and it's governments that are making choices to treat Australians in this way. And many of the people that are being treated this poorly are the very people who we depend on to keep the economy and society running while we're all in this awful pandemic period.
Absolutely, thank you. And I've got a number of questions coming through, and I might ask Eva Cox. Eva, could you put your speaker on? And you've got a question, I think, which is
hang on,
quite important.
I just need to find where I am so I can...
We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, you can hear me, okay. Look, I mean, I'm concerned because I think when you listen to this, and particularly because I've got an interest, obviously, in the point that's just been raised about the fact that so much of the market really destroys the women's stuff, and it's on the edge of the unpaid work and the paid work connection. And because of that, and unfortunately the unions have a bit of a problem with that too, it has never been seen as skilled and professional, as things which require at least as many skills and competencies, but happen to be mainly occupied by blokes who've got tools in their hands. But it does raise issues about the sort of failure of the current workforce to really deal with a lot of those sorts of issues. And if you look at the future, I mean, what I'm hearing here is a lot of attempts to try and get back to some sort of control over the employers. But what we've got is a much greater push by employers one way or the other to have as little to do with the hiring of their workers as they possibly can. And therefore you've got gig economy, you've got all of those other things there. And I think if the union movement just focuses on trying to control it and have the image of the big union movement, the big union and the big employer creating, or their groups creating better things, it's going to be very difficult, because I just think those employment groups will just disappear in the distance. So one of the things that I'm interested in for a whole range of reasons is looking at why we don't have a universal basic income. And the one thing I think we could talk about in this area is, if we want workers to be able to combine, to be able to act together, to be able to argue for decent working conditions, they can't be frozen into terror that if they lose their job, they're not going to be able to pay their basic living expenses. An introduction of some form of universal payment, which covered basic things, would give them then the capacity to argue for decent pay and walk out of jobs which are just really crappy, which they can't do at the moment. And I think we need to start looking at how we can balance the work by ensuring that people do not fall out of the pay, the income area if they don't get a paid job, because we don't know what paid jobs are going to be like in the next 20 to 30 years. They may well disappear much more so than they do now. But a lot of the unpaid stuff, which we don't value, will then be will then end up picking things up. But if we actually have a sort of paid, unpaid movement of people into the workforce, in a few years' time, we might be able to manage where people can get together as cooperatives and various things in a small group thing, because they're not dependent on their boss providing them money. So I'm just sort of trying to put this on the agenda, because the unions tend to get hysterical at the idea of a universal basic income. How dare we value the fact that people are going to be paid unpaid? But if we start looking at the way that they can actually balance each other off, so people actually can afford to do some unpaid and some paid stuff, we might have something which is a genuine attempt to look at a future which is not going to be big firms and big unions. But
all right, thank you for the question. So that's it is a controversial issue amongst the labour movement, which I think splits people along all sorts of different perspectives. But Sarah, did you have a comment about a proposal for a UBI?
Not so much the UBI, because I must confess I don't feel qualified to jump in to that debate. It's not my area. But as a tangent that Eva mentioned, and I thought of when I saw her original comment, is the idea of cooperative and cooperative arrangements. And we have seen in sort of what we might call gig areas, the emergence of cooperatives that have been quite successful in local communities. So we think of sort of gig platforms, and we think of these kind of monolithic sort of global entities, but we have seen some successes at a local level with cooperative platforms really leveraging, I guess, local communities and relationships. And we also had Claire mention the aged care workforce and disability care workforce, which are close to my heart. They were my PhD focus. And there is a cooperative called this Cooperative Life that has been working very effectively in the area of age and disability care services. And I think the one of the issues there is getting enough understanding in the community about what these different models might look like, and how then to scale those to take on, I guess, some of those bigger platforms, because they are a really legitimate and long-term, they've got a long history, alternative to the business structures which we spoke about and which David Weil speaks about, and all of those concerns. So I think they're very much worth us as a society considering more closely.
Tim, I might also get your perspective on this, because I think implicit in Eva's question was almost the suggestion that wrestling with the proliferation of these different insecure structures is almost too big a task. They're almost impossible to defeat, and therefore looking at a different approach might be the way to go. Is that something that you would concede at the UWU?
Well, I mean, I think Eva might be pleased to know that back in March, the United Workers Union put out its initial response to the COVID pandemic, which called for a guaranteed livable income for everyone, universally applied. And once again, it's the cornerstone of our response to the Senate inquiry. And in actual fact, I'm speaking tonight at an organisation called Life, a living income for everyone, which the union will be endorsing, about a universal basic guaranteed income that we need to get us through this pandemic. And in some respects, if you think about the gig discussion we just had, really a lot of it's around about categories of employment that have been within the common law for some time. But what we really need to talk about is about workers who can, there's a growing divide between workers who can stay safe and workers who can't stay safe. And in this crisis, it's very much a gendered outcome. So increasingly, it's the women who can't stay safe. And there's been no discussion about where is the productivity gains from these new technology platforms and how they shared with workers, and where the new ownership models and cooperatives have been referred to. So, I mean, we see great opportunities to deal with some of these issues, because workers do need a right of refusal from poor and exploitative work practices. We organise workers in fresh food supply chain and farms, and also we see it in a lot of our structured areas, such as aged care that Clare referred to, and early childhood education as well. And so one of the things is that what happens with discussions about UBI becomes very polarised. You're either for it or against it. And the reality is it's a continuum, and essentially what this pandemic allows us to do as a society is say, how do we actually make certain that everyone is brought along together, that we are in all this together, and that we do have more a universal approach so people can make sensible decisions about not only their health, but also about the way they interact with people. And so our idea of being obsessed about a labourist notion, which is a traditional view of unionism in Australia, Eva, but I would say that it's not universal anymore. There's a debate going on inside organised labour, but I think there's a lot of merit to what Sarah and Eva and Clare are saying. But I think that Australia increasingly has to be on that journey about the nature of work has changed, and the days of a bloke going off bashing a piece of metal for 8 hours is not there anymore. And too often, the work that we really rely on and what we've been revealed in this crisis is people in feminised industries and service sectors doing low-paid work, making certain our society sticks together, whether that is the unpaid, unrecognised part of work, which Eva was pointing out, all the way through to the way we've kind of formalised it, whether it be in early childhood care or aged care or all sorts of other forms. And I think that is a challenge for organised labour. We do need to think far more broadly about these things, about what creates a good society, and how do we pick up on a crisis such as this and actually look at those notions of ownership. How can we reclaim the commons? How can we get an equitable redistribution of our enormous wealth? There is no reason that today there's an announcement being made by the government that they'll maintain JobKeeper less than the minimum wage. I mean, we're a very wealthy country, and we can deal with these things. The other day, I was just noticing a statement by Guy Ryder from the ILO saying that he said, in the first month of this pandemic, outside the first world, most global workers survive in the informal economy. 60% try to exist in the informal economy. And in the first month, their average incomes in the informal economy fell by over 60%. So you think about all those workers in India and the like. And so what he warned us is that there's another pandemic coming, and it's not a pandemic based on health, it's a pandemic of hunger of enormous proportions. And here we are in Australia setting up a system where we're deciding who's a deserving poor, who's undeserving poor, who's a worker in this category, you'll get this much, who's a worker in this category, you'll get this much. There is a fundamental problem about social solidarity here that we need to address as a nation.
Yeah, that's another form of fissuring, isn't it? Splintering us into all sorts of different directions and different groups of worthy and unworthy, in the same way that we've seen the approach to construction and blue-collar support for those industries as opposed to the arts and the tertiary education sector, where there's been almost a job killer scheme underway. So,
Josh, can I just jump in on Eva's point? Eva, I think it's a really important idea for us to be talking about, and I love a big radical concept, so I'm really glad you asked that question. It's a challenging one for Labor people because, you know, my political party was created on the basis of the importance of work, and work is at the centre of a decent life. That's unpaid or paid work. And so I feel like we need to countenance these ideas when we've done every single thing possible to make work work. And then if it still doesn't work, then we start to talk about paying people to not work. And that idea troubles me so greatly. I can only imagine what we would look back on in a generation if we made a policy decision that there are certain people in the labour market who should be paid to do not any paid work. I just find that it just makes my stomach turn, honestly. But the important thing is there is so much we can do to make work actually provide decent incomes for Australians. And that's the history of the social compact in our country. It's been a growing economy where all boats rise together because work provides an improved standard of living for most Australians most of the time. Now, if we look back to the reforms made by the Hawke and Keating government, you know, they made, you know, massive amounts of economic change. They also made huge social change to ensure that Australians got to benefit from that, like Medicare, superannuation, and a profound change to the extent at which young people in Australia were getting educated and getting trained up for the new jobs that were coming into the economy. Now, that made sure that during that period, the economy over a 30-year period, it basically doubled in size. Most people saw their standard of living increase dramatically, and even people who were on very low incomes were still on lower incomes at the end of it, but their standard of living was much higher than it was to start with. That model of using work to distribute economic gains that are being accumulated nationally, it isn't working anymore. So if we go back to the last sort of 10 years, we have completely dropped the ball in public policy in thinking about how we create those new institutions to share the benefits of the way the economy is changing. So we know, for example, that lots more high-skilled jobs are being created. We're not helping young people get more skilled than they were getting 10 or 20 years ago. We are not doing much to make sure that the skills sector talks to the private sector so that we're not filling skills gaps by importing people from overseas when there are Australians who could be perfectly easily trained to do those jobs. So I think, you know, as we've discussed, we are not properly valuing and paying the predominantly female workforce who work in these caring roles that we know are going to, you know, grow massively over the coming generation, and we get to decide whether those jobs are decent jobs or not. So I reckon until we're doing all those things and they're being shown not to work, that's when we start to turn to things like universal basic income. Certainly in a pandemic context, I think it's a slightly different situation. But, you know, let's not let governments off the hook here. We need to be much more bold, much more visionary and more radical about how we think about sharing economic gains. And we're not doing that right now. So let's try that first, I think, before we turn away from the concept of work as a mode of sharing the rewards of the economy.
Thank you so much for being so frank about that. And I'll come back to bold visionary proposals shortly. And Eva, I know you want to ask some other questions, but in the interest of managing time and fairness, I've got to try and accommodate some other questions. A couple of others have wanted to ask about really union membership, which has declined for a long period of time, and how unions are faring during the pandemic. So I've had a question along those lines earlier. Where is it? I'll just see if I can find it. Penelope Hume has asked the question. Also, one other person has asked the question. Sorry, I can't find your name at the moment. But Tim, perhaps you can at least speak to your experience at the UWU. I don't know whether you have any information about what's going on across the broader union movement, but clearly the need for unions and a strong worker voice at the moment is is huge. Is that being reflected in any renewed interest in membership of unions?
I think the crisis that we're living through now impacts unions because we're part of the society that is facing it. There is no doubt that the levels of trust in the idea of workers coming together to form a union has never been higher in my time in working with the union movement. So trust levels are at a strong point. So people are looking to work together to solve issues. The issue, you know, specifically to the United Workers Union is that I can look at our universe in three categories, if I could put it that way. We have you can call it the last line of defence or the first line of defence, but our workers in early childhood education and care and aged care and in the hospital sector in various parts around Australia have been right at that sharp end of this crisis for some time. And for some of them, they're working really hard, such as cleaners in hospitals, for example, and who are fundamental to our safety and who are low paid, all the way through to early childhood educators who are losing work because of the crazy approach to public policy around it and the lack of a strong worker voice around safety. Then we've got on the other side is we've got a whole lot of workers who have just lost work very quickly early on in the crisis and still haven't got back. And they're people connected to the entertainment industry and the like. So that's hospitality and entertainment. So you think of the big employers that casinos are of working people, and they've all lost their work. And all have been out of work for the entire journey, basically. And then we have a whole segment involved in food manufacturing, packaging manufacturing, logistics, poultry, dairy, who have been working really hard, but in ways that are very close. Because if you're in a poultry processing line, you're standing very close. It's a wet environment and it's a dangerous environment. But if we don't keep those things moving, you see what happens. Our supermarket warehouse workers, they work really hard for a period of time to make certain that people got as much toilet paper as they needed to wrap themselves in. And so there has been enormous hours put in there. So we've got some people working harder than ever before. We've got some people who have lost a lot of work and lost their jobs. And that's across all, and manufacturing, that's happened. People talk about manufacturing, but we've got lots of people being laid off where employers are saying, you know what, I don't want to build up the liabilities by keeping people on JobKeeper. I'm just going to make them redundant. So we've had lots of those situations. And then we've got people at the sharp end who are working in close proximity to people who need to be looked after. So we reflect the society that we live in. And so there's some of the examples.
And so, in short, does that mean in some areas there's increased interest in membership, but at the same time you're taking hits from people losing jobs? Is that the?
So I looked at our statistics last week, and so most of our members in casinos have stayed with us through this time, even though they've lost work. But we'll have to work that out in the future. But in logistics and food, our membership's gone up. In aged care, our membership has gone up. In a lot of the public sector areas, our membership's gone up because people have turned to the unions right now. And so generally our organising is very much a physical one. And while many of our organisers are still out in the warehouses and the factories, a lot can't go on site. And so people are actually seeking out the union online and joining. So I would say that at this part of the crisis, our membership is slightly up. But my view is that the economic crisis coming and the unemployment wave that is coming is going to do enormous damage to the economy if we don't think differently about certain things. And so, I don't want Claire to think that we've lost interest in the value and dignity of work, Claire, but I think some of the things about guaranteed livable incomes for people is not about saying sit at home and play PlayStation. It's about how you can actually get through life at a certain point. Yeah.
And speaking of the sort of unemployment that you just painted a very grim picture of, and the value and dignity of work, today the federal government announced that JobKeeper would be extended, but the payments would be cut. So, for example, instead of $1,500 a fortnight. They're being cut to $1,200 a fortnight, and then there's progressive cuts thereafter. And Claire, that, I suppose, presents straight away a question for the opposition and what its view is of proposals to cut the level of support in the form of JobKeeper. I think also what was announced was a renewed focus on mutual obligations, so further obligations on the unemployed, jump through various hoops to ensure they can still be paid JobKeeper. So I was wondering whether you could comment on both of those dimensions to the new policy.
Yeah, I mean, not in a detailed way, Josh, because those changes were only announced about an hour ago, I think. So we haven't sort of worked through who's going to be worse off. But I guess one of the things I just note straight off the bat is that none of the big problems that Labor's been pointing out with this scheme have been fixed. The single biggest one there is the exclusion of casual workers from JobKeeper. Everything we've talked about in this call just should highlight that this is a very significant share of the workforce that just got cut off from this kind of principal mechanism of social support that's been provided during the pandemic. And I don't think anything is going to change there. The job seeker cuts, that will be concerning. And Labor's been advocating for an increase to what was the old New Start. Again, we need to see, there's been a number of changes that have been made to job seeker, and I don't know what the overall impact of those will be. They've changed the threshold of income that you can earn before you get job seeker as well. In terms of the mutual obligations, that really worries me. I think anytime you start to hear these kind of governments talking about mutual obligations, they're opening up a pathway to imply that unemployment's somehow the fault of the person who doesn't have work, and that's something that I sort of generally object to in the best of times. But in a moment like this, where we know we're going to have double-digit unemployment for as long into the future as we can see, that's just totally inappropriate. So we need to understand a bit more about what's involved there. I think it's important for us to just know a bit more of the detail, but, that sort of politics just worries me. And I certainly, Tim talked about solidarity here. Like, if one thing's been good about COVID so far, it's that we've tried to stick together as a nation, and anything that unravels that, I think we're going to regret greatly down the line.
All right, thank you. And Sarah, I just might get you to comment, particularly as someone working in the tertiary education sector, where there's going to be a lot of people formerly employed by universities out of work. Any concluding comments in the context of this new policy change?
Look, I think the thing is, universities weren't eligible for those schemes. So we had our casual and non-permanent workers really have to fend for themselves. And estimates that I've seen of the scale of that are in the tens of thousands of workers. So I think someone else, in the comments mentioned other groups of workers who weren't captured by those schemes. And I know we've been talking about UBI and MMT and other things which are, might be fit for other days and discussions on other days. But I think we need to remember that there are a whole lot of people that have fallen through those cracks. And the one thing I wanted to end on, Josh, I am an incredibly pragmatic person, and these big discussions are fantastic and interesting, but I'm also really interested in what we can do now around some of these issues. What could happen? And I saw a comment from someone talking about the aged care sector and saying, well, we could tie government funds to outcomes for workers. And I go back to the point I made earlier. There are levers there for differences to be made to how workers experience work that we just don't use at the moment and could use. And we see that in the discussion about procurement with Victorian security. So I hate to bring it back to more mundane issues, but there is capacity in existing frames to actually be a bit creative while we go on having those really significant, important macroeconomic discussions about where we take things. But I think let's also look at what could be things we could do right now.
And
Sorry, Josh. Oh, just want to say one more thing. Just as we're talking about the pragmatics, I really want to back in what Sarah said there. A lot of my job is thinking about the long-term future of our country. I just want everyone to just turn their minds to the issues facing young people who are graduating into today's employment market. The young people who are, graduating into this market will have lifelong consequences attached to what's going on at the moment in the economy, and we really need to be putting all of our big brains into thinking about how we're going to improve the life chances of those kids who were already actually doing it really tough before this hit us.
All right, I'm going to have to leave it there because we've just hit time. I thank all the panellists. I thank everybody assisting in organising this, and it's been a fascinating discussion which has travelled far and wide and only scratched the surface on some big issues, and a good reminder that in the meantime there are some very practical and pragmatic policy levers that can be pulled at various levels of government. So thank you very much to everybody who participated, helped organise this, and also our panellists. And see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.